Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, author and historian Larry Hancock steps into the vault. He explores the dark and sinister history of the CIA's role in political assassinations. After he lays out the documented past of these covert agendas, he explores how these operations may have laid out the blueprint for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
The first phase had been with poison, and the second phase appears to have been with sniper teams. You ended up with a dictator who was so brutal that the legacy was anti-Americanism. They would attempt to conduct assassinations, either of political leaders or, especially this occurred repeatedly with Fidel Castro. In Dallas goes back to a very specific group of CIA officers and Cuban exiles who had been involved in operations to kill Fidel Castro, essentially being retargeted on JFK.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is another edition of the Black Vault Radio. As always, thank you so much for making this your podcast and radio show of choice, however you are streaming it. I know that there are a ton of options out there, and I hope you enjoyed the very special edition that I posted last, episode number 11, wherein I welcomed George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell into the vault. Now, it was a very informative show. It was an extended version. If you haven't listened to it, definitely go back into the archives. Everything is free and available to you, where you can stream the entire interview. Special editions are going to pop up from time to time here on the Black Vault Radio. If you missed it, the short synopsis of what a special edition is all of the different segments that I have here on the Black Vault Radio episodes are dropped, except the TBV dialogue segment, which is the interview itself. Generally, they will be expanded, so this was a much longer interview than normal. George and Jeremy were very gracious with their time with me, answering a lot of questions. A lot of information came out. We really dug deep into the new film, Hunt for the Skinwalker. I do recommend that you watch it, check it out, not only the interview, but the film itself. We've heard a lot about the Skinwalker Ranch and some of the strange paranormal occurrences that are going on over there. Well, this film gives kind of a visual representation to the words that we've been hearing. George wrote a great book about it many years ago. Well, now this film really kind of gets in there and explores some of the archived footage from George Knapp's personal archives that he shot out there many years ago while the investigations were going on. So it's a very cool look, at least so you can get an idea what's going on the ranch and what the ranch looks like, because we really haven't had that yet. And again, definitely check out that special edition. I'm proud of how the interview came out. Of course, there were many more questions that I wanted to ask, some of the feedback from you, and trust me, I agree with you. There were many more follow-up questions to ask, but keep in mind that this is a film, and I wanted to respect the fact that Jeremy was breaking a little bit of information in his film as well. So I didn't want to just blow it all before the film was even released. So, of course, there were follow-up questions. I hope Jeremy will consider coming back once everybody has a time to see the film, digest it a little bit, and then maybe we'll ask some follow-ups, maybe dig a little bit deeper. Where did he get that information? Who was talking to him? Who did he talk to that really paved the way for him to put in his film some of the revelations that he did, including the government, specifically the Defense Intelligence Agency's involvement in the Skinwalker Ranch investigations. So hopefully Jeremy will come back. It was great to have him on before, but of course, everything begs to have follow-up questions once the general public has time to digest it and really kind of understand what the film is all about and what claims are being made. Now, that being said, some things to deal with here before we get into the news. And then in the TBV Dialogue segment, Mr. Larry Hancock, author, historian, really eclectic background on what he has researched. He's going to be joining me to talk about CIA political assassinations. Yep, really deep, dark, sinister stuff. We get into covert ops. We're going to get into all sorts of stuff. But he's got an eclectic background in regards to the 9 books that he has published on various topics. And again, we're just digging into the CIA political assassinations. But man, he's done a lot of work over the years. He's written a lot of books. And so kudos to him for that success. But I'm glad that he's going to be joining me. And we're going to dig deep into those CIA political assassinations. Now, a couple things, like I said, to deal with. If you miss this, I want to bring it up. Now, here on the Black Vault Radio, we have talked a little bit about the To the Stars Academy and the revelations about what the media touted as the secret Pentagon UFO study, or ATIP. And there has been a lot of conversations, not only on this program, but in the public in general, and it's starting to get fairly controversial. My claims, my information, and my thoughts on the topic are becoming very controversial. I don't mean them to be, but they are, and here's why. For those who don't know, the brief synopsis, and I'll make it brief. I'm thinking about maybe doing a full show, maybe just another special edition, where I explore and just talk to you about this program as a whole and really dig deep. Yes, it'll be a little bit in-depth, but maybe that just needs to happen. In December of 2017, the news broke that there was this secret Pentagon UFO study. Now, a story like that, I'm all over it for obvious reasons. And I have spent 22 years of my life now, as of this month, 22 plus years, exploring the government's connection to UFO investigations. They have their public statements, meaning they want you to believe that they stopped UFO investigations in 1969, and I have spent years and years and years uncovering documents, many of which that support that those investigations did not stop. They've never seen the light of day before. And so I've got quite a few different documents to kind of put on the table, so to speak, to show that even before the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, the secret Pentagon UFO study, before that ever was in existence, I was able to prove, and am able to prove, that UFOs were of interest to the military. So when this story came out, I was all over it. And I started filing FOIA requests, trying to get answers. It's great to have kind of the rough overview of it, which is what we got from the New York Times and Politico and the 1,200 million other places that covered this story. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure we can all agree on that. So I started digging, and I started digging deep, and I started digging through archives in the United States government, specifically the intelligence community, some that aren't really actively requested from through the Freedom of Information Act. I'm not the only one, but I can say I'm one of the only ones because some of these systems are not very well known, one of which would be Intellipedia. And this is a intelligence community, we'll call it like a Wikipedia engine. It's built in the same way. and they use it as a reference. So many things that are intelligence community related, anything when it comes to intelligence, is generally in this system. Now, to give you a quick overview, I fought very hard to get the statistics page declassified from this Intellipedia system. Now, it's interesting to note that it's not actually one system. Intellipedia is 3 systems. Now, I have talked about that before on the Black Vault Radio, so I won't go into too much more detail, but the 3 systems that encompass Intellipedia as a whole is the for official use only, or the unclassified level. So this is still official stuff, not accessible by the public, but very low level, if any, classification whatsoever. The second level is secret. The third level is top secret. Now, I know, based on the engine that they built, that there is a statistics page. I originally was denied access to that, and after appealing and fighting for it, I finally was able to get it declassified, and I discovered that there were millions of pages in it, literally millions and millions of entries of all sorts of information. I went after documents related to ATIP in the system. I came up negative. They said that ATIP, in the various ways that the name is referenced, did not appear a single time anywhere in those millions of pages. That, to me, was a red flag. That's not the only one. In fact, there's a much bigger list than there was 8 months ago, but there is a growing list of red flags about the claims behind ATIP and so on. So if you missed it, I published a open letter invitation. I have done the invitation here verbally, and many of you have actually tagged Tom DeLonge and To the Stars Academy's website, and I appreciate that. Continue to do it. But based on the popularity of my idea of getting, these guys on specifically, I would love and be honored to welcome Mr. Luis Elizondo into the vault and ask him questions and pick his brain a little bit, not to be combative, not to be aggressive, and not to challenge his honor, integrity, or service to our country, but rather clarify some of these red flags. Now, I have written a very big article on all of these, again, what I call red flags, but it's my research through FOIA. You can access it online at theblackvault.com/TTSA. That will forward you to this big article. So I published this letter. It was an open letter to Mr. Tom DeLonge and Mr. Luis Elizondo and the entire team at To the Stars Academy. And I took a lot of time to really try and make it as condensed as possible, but show them my concerns, that I am not questioning to derail their agenda, that I'm not posing these questions to be combative or fight with them or say they are lying. On the contrary, I'm just trying to get answers. I'm just trying to get to the truth. And even though it was a 150% genuine invitation for any of them to join me on the air, part of it was also symbolic, that I do hope that they read the letter and realize that I am not alone in wanting answers to this. Now, of course, there are people that are attacking me about all of this, and that's fine. That's okay. I don't see a problem with asking questions. Asking questions does not equate to criticism. It is just simply asking a question. And sadly, I think the noisy, as Stanton Friedman would call them, the noisy negativists about my questioning and my bringing some of these things up, they're not doing To the Stars any favors by doing that. In fact, some of them, just in the last couple of days, have literally made up things about me to try and prove a point, some of which is said to my face. Other times I stumble on it in a forum or a tweet on Twitter, but literally blatant lies. And I'll end it this way, and just to kind of give you an example that this is not doing To the Stars any favors, I posted a document that even though Intellipedia did not have any entries for ATIP, I recently discovered in just the last few days they do now. And I published the document. It's controversial, of course, because it supports the name, the true name that the Pentagon is claiming the program was called, and it contradicts, again, Mr. Luis Elizondo's name, which they kind of switch the word aviation versus aerospace. Sounds like semantics and sounds like it's not a big deal, but it to me it is. And the reason it is it goes to the core of what this story is all about, and it goes to the root of the credibility behind the story and the claims that have been touted by the mainstream media, or a lot of mainstream media articles anyway, and to the Stars Academy. So this is a small percentage of the red flags, but it's a red flag nonetheless. I bring out this document, and one guy attacks me for blacking out information, including the author's name. Now, just so you all know, that's redacted by the U.S. government and is a Freedom of Information Act exemption. It's called B6, and it's for privacy reasons. It's so we don't understand or know or can comprehend who is working for the NSA, because that is exempted from the Freedom of Information Act. So people started posting, one person in particular, very loudly, that I was covering up the information. So that is not doing any of this any favors. The questions that I have are legitimate. The open letter is available for all of you to read. Again, theblackvault.com/TTSA. I will also link all of this from the show notes at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. The reason why I'm bringing all of this up is it is kind of a firestorm on quite a few different social networks and forums. Because I published this letter, I do not have a response. It's been about a week and a half at this point. Do I expect one? Not really. I appeared on Jimmy Church's Fade to Black last night. Had a lot of fun, as I always do with Jimmy. And Jimmy picked my brain quite a bit on this new document. So I'll let you guys all listen to Jimmy's show, because we do spend a lot of time on it. But one interesting thing was that Jimmy has connections with Tom DeLonge and To the Stars Academy, but specifically Tom himself, and reached out. And Tom DeLonge was gracious enough to reply. Now, I don't have the exact verbatim response. However, paraphrasing it was a thank you for the invitation. In essence, now was not the right time for them to appear on the air with me. And they respectfully, and I want to stress respectfully, there was nothing rude or negatively toned by the letter, but they denied the invitation. So I've always cringed when being asked about questions on ATIP. Sadly, though, I have to go with the information that I have. And the reason I cringe is because I have tried to reach out for them. You'll see this in more detail in the letter that I published. But I tried for 4 months, actually, without publicizing it in the general public at all. I kept very, very quiet about it. I talked to the Stars Academy and their PR agent and representative. And sadly, after 4 months of being told we're working on it, we're advocating for it, we want this to happen, so on and so forth, they completely shot it down. And I really did try to stress to them that I want to be respectful and all I'm interested in the truth. So that being said, I am contemplating maybe just doing a full show, because as you can tell, you'll probably talk for quite a bit on it, but at least lay it all out there. Jimmy's show on Fade to Black last night, I laid out some of it, but I can't do it all in a show like that. I don't control the interview. Jimmy does a great job, don't get me wrong. But what I mean by that is there's a lot more to say. There's a lot more red flags. There's a lot more questions. And I think that there's a lot more misconceptions out there, especially when I see these people making up stuff about me personally. There's a lot of misconceptions on, number one, why I'm asking questions, but number two, how things work. And I think that that is something important to deal with. Will I get hate mail? I'm sure I will, but I think it's important, and I believe that we should all have a discussion and be able to openly question about this stuff without fear that we're going to be attacked because we're quote-unquote criticizing, and that is not what questioning is all about. So that being said, check out that open letter. I invite you all, maybe shoot to the Stars Academy a letter of support if you agree with me that maybe an open forum, a dialogue would be something that we would all benefit from about these topics, because it is very, very fascinating. It's just fairly controversial at this point. So let's just kind of get it all on the table, have a great, respectful conversation. It'll be fun, entertaining, informative, but most of all, respective. And I want to stress that R word, respective. That being said, thank you all for that. Check out that letter. And before we get to Mr. Larry Hancock and his very eclectic line of books, and we're going to be diving deep into the CIA political assassinations, we're going to deal with some headlines on TBV News. On this episode's TBV News segment, the segment where I speak about a few headlines that you may or may not have missed, there's quite a bit actually to deal with, and I don't go too long with news headlines, but I do like to punch a few of them. So I've kind of whittled it down to a few, and I thought I would bring this up to you. While we were in between our last episode and now, a very interesting story developed and very much got, I don't know if it was blown out of proportion or where some of these rumors came from, but the Sunspot Observatory in New Mexico was mysteriously shut down by the FBI. Now, if you didn't hear about this, it literally, they shut the doors, they put the crime scene tape up, and no one was allowed in to this place. Now, of course, the internet being what it is, and I love it dearly, but of course the rumor mill started. Now, I don't want to place blame on anybody, but of course some of those tabloidish papers outside of the United States, namely in Europe and England and the UK, decided to start the rumor that all of this had to do with potentially them receiving an alien signal. And all of a sudden, the alien rumor went rampant for about a week. Now, whether or not there was any truth to that, I've never been able to find really a valid source of how that rumor came up. But since it was an observatory and the FBI was involved, immediately I think somebody said, hey, wait a minute, this is like Contact. Carl Sagan wrote about it. A signal's received, they shut everything down, government takes over. Aha, this is it. And I think that this got really blown out of proportion. It's worth a mention, though, because there's really not a whole lot of answers about what was going on here. Since the observatory was closed down by the FBI, and the FBI was very, very tight-lipped about what they were doing and why they shut it down. They finally did talk about it about a week after the fact, that they were actually investigating, and I hate to even, I cringe when I have to talk about this, child pornography. And apparently the investigation led them to an IP address. This is a very unique technical term, but a very unique identifier for every computer that's on the internet. If you don't know what that means, your computer right now, if you're listening on your computer, even if you're streaming this on your phone, if you're surfing the internet in any way, you have a specific, unique IP address to that system that you are using. And it's called an IP address. And it's a string of numbers separated by periods, and it identifies where you are and how you're accessing the internet. So, for example, I use Charter. So if I were to give out my IP address over the air, you could trace it and essentially find out the general area I'm at. And then you can also figure out that it's owned by Charter. Well, law enforcement uses these things to track down when somebody is up to no good. And they did that with this specific IP address, and it tracked back to the Sunspot Observatory. In essence, somebody within the observatory was distributing child pornography to the internet, receiving it, downloading it, all of the above. It's not really well known, not that I really care on which way it's going, but that's what they found on one of the systems. Now, of course, that then took the rumor mill to even greater lengths, because it has long been rumored that type of horrific evidence is often planted to frame people or to discredit them and so on. I won't name the person within the UFO community that's recently been entwined in such a child pornographic charge, but that being said, one has been, and of course the conspiracy mill works and generates these rumors. Now, in the end, they have produced the search warrant that they used and executed to shut down the Sunspot Observatory. It sounded like that Sunspot Observatory, that it was management that decided to shut down the entire facility. That way the FBI could do their investigation, figure out what's going on. So I bring it up just simply because the rumor mill really does take over on a lot of these stories. We shouldn't jump to those conclusions. Of course, jumping to the alien thing when generally it has nothing to do with aliens doesn't really do any of us any good. Now, speaking of space, this is probably a story you haven't heard much of, and it really makes me sad about these types of stories and discoveries, so I want to bring it up now. Japan actually launched a probe to, specifically a robot, less of a probe, but specifically a robot, to land on an asteroid that they named Ryugu. And now the European Space Agency, they landed one on their Rosetta mission, and there were phenomenal images. If you didn't see that, I believe it was probably close to 2 years ago, maybe a year or two ago. They're amazing photos. Well, Japan now did it, and they recently landed 2 tiny robots on this asteroid, and they've sent back pictures of this asteroid and their descent in. The pictures are just fantastic. I mean, these are literally alien worlds that we never really get to see in such great detail. And on September 21st, 2018, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, with their Hayabusa 2 spacecraft, landed these 2 tiny robots on the asteroid. Again, the photographs are phenomenal. Of course, the news right now is just inundated with not only politics, but specifically the Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh nomination. And that has really kind of flooded everything. All of that is very important for the news to deal with. Sure, great, exciting, sleazy in some channels. But that being said, some of these stories that are being overlooked is just a shame. So check out the pictures. I've got them posted. Again, the show notes page where all of these articles are linked, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Now, the last story I want to deal with is one on the FOIA front. For those who don't file FOIAs, this is fairly interesting and fairly embarrassing for the United States government. The short of it is, when you file Freedom of Information Act requests, there's a couple ways to do it. For many years, the only way to do it was to send postal mail. So you had to slap a stamp on an envelope, put your FOIA request inside, and send it off and hope for the best. As the years went on and the passing of the Electronic Freedom of Information Act back in 1996, it then opened up agencies to start utilizing email addresses, not all, but some, email addresses to accept Freedom of Information Act requests, and of course you can always fax them. There's another method that I absolutely loathe and hate. It's disgusting, simply because some agencies now have adopted what some call these PAL systems, P-A-L, and one of which, and many of them have these different PAL systems. So you have to use different usernames, different passwords, depending upon what agency you're going to. One has tried to kind of consolidate and centralize it, called FOIA Online, F-O-I-A Online. And this is a government-run site, and not every agency is in it, but a lot of them are. And they recently just did an upgrade. Now, I hate using them for quite a few different reasons. It's the silliness of their password requirement. You have to make these insane passwords, and then you have to change them every 2 months. And then on top of that, you can't use the same password again. In fact, you have to go through 25 passwords every couple months on these long, ridiculous strings before you can start repeating them. And I have had such a time trying to keep track of all of the different passwords and how they rotate and make you change it and so on. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, I don't mean to complain too much about it, but it really is just an awful system. I hate it. And whenever I can, I just use faxes, and I just, I'll pile on the faxes. And, I hate to make more work for them, but, these systems are ridiculous. Well, here's some more hatred that we can spew the way of these PAL systems and FOIA Online. Recently, FOIA Online did an upgrade. They called it FOIA Online 3.0, I believe is what they were calling it. In essence, they kind of upgraded the software. Yay, yippee, because it needed it. But it upgraded the software, relaunched it. CNN, as far as I can tell, was the one that actually caught this before anyone else. There was a bug in the new system. When you utilize the Freedom of Information Act and you use these systems, sometimes on some occasions, You actually have to put in your social security number to the system. They launched this FOIA Online 3.0, and what did they do? The glitch was it started showing people's social security numbers. They were not shielded. They were not protected. CNN had counted at least 80. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that is enough. It only takes one. They counted at least 80 social security numbers that were fully or partially published. It was a big blunder by the United States government. CNN alerted them to the issue, and of course they tried to change it and kind of essentially, I don't want to say cover up in a bad way, but I think that they tried to not deal with it. That's a pretty big error, and I think that they didn't really want to bring a whole lot of attention to it. So they've addressed the error, according to them. The EPA specifically, the Environmental Protection Agency, is the one that is involved from the technical end on this specific agency, I guess, or this specific system, that they did implement some changes and some bug fixes and saved it. But man, that's a huge blunder. And man, does that really support my line of reasoning for never using these online systems. So I bring this up just to kind of show the ridiculousness of what is going on, and be careful whenever you put your name into a system like this, especially if it's run by the United States government. You never know what kind of mistakes can happen when your personal information then gets broadcast to the world. I've had it happen myself, not my social security number, but sadly my personal home address. I no longer live there, so it doesn't really matter. But many years ago, the government inadvertently published my personal home address, which for the Black Vault was never public. I do have a private mailbox, a suite number that you guys can all send in your postcards and holiday greetings and whatever you'd like, even your hate mail. I take that and read it too. But that being said, I've never published my home address. The government did. So even though it wasn't my social security number, sure made me pretty uncomfortable when that appeared. And along with it, they published my home telephone number at the time. And yes, I did receive phone calls after that. Not fun. Not a good time. So anyway, that completes the headlines, and I don't want to waste any more time. Coming up on TBV Dialogues, author, historian Larry Hancock is going to be exploring all things CIA political assassinations, covert ops, and maybe we'll even dive into the JFK assassination. Stay tuned. That's coming up. On this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, I welcome author Larry Hancock into the vault. Larry brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his extensive writing on Cold War history and on multiple aspects of national security. He is a graduate of the University of New Mexico. He earned his BA with honors, having majored in history, cultural anthropology, and education. He also served in the United States Air Force, which led him to a career in computer communications and technology marketing. Larry has 9 books currently in print, and his most recent works include Killing King, an exposure of the conspiracy behind the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and Creating Chaos, Political Warfare from Truman to Putin. Larry, thank you so much for joining me on the Black Vault Radio.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and I have to say this too for the audience just to understand your background. When we were trying to figure out what to speak about on the show, it was so difficult because all of your 9 books that are currently in print, and I do highly recommend everybody to check them out, you have an eclectic group of titles. And just to name a couple, you've written a book on UFOs called Unidentified. You've written one called Surprise Attack, which deals with, surprise attacks from Pearl Harbor to Benghazi. You've written about the JFK assassination, CIA assassinations, which is what we're going to be getting into now. You have a wide background, so it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about a couple books that you've written on CIA political assassinations. Now, let me just first ask you, how did you get into writing about that?
I really got into all of this, quite frankly, through the JFK assassination, and my interest in that because of my age and having been alive at that time. I was interested in it. I got involved with a Dallas reporter who had been covering that story. I helped her do some historical research for a book of hers, and then I just became intrigued. I've always been interested in the military and in national security. That led me into the documents, police documents, FBI documents, CIA documents, and from then, 100,000 pages of documents later, there we are.
Yeah, I know that feeling. They just kind of keep piling up like that. Now, focusing in on the CIA, how many books have you written about the CIA and political assassinations?
I've really written 3 that specifically deal with the CIA. Nexus was my first book on, and directly focused on how the CIA itself got into political assassination, who authorized it, what were the practices used, and looking into the various examples of what the agency did when it worked, when it didn't work. So that was Nexus, and that really focused on the time period of the 50s and 60s. From there, I decided I was really interested in, I wanted a broader view of what the CIA was doing, and that led me into writing Shadow Warfare, which basically explores all aspects of covert warfare by the agency, including regime change operations, the use of surrogate military forces, and how that changed not only from early in the Cold War all the way through contemporary practices. And then after I finished that, I decided there was one more aspect that needed to be covered, and that was political warfare. So I broadened my scope again and looked at the whole spectrum of political warfare, including psychological warfare, agents of influence, and took a look at both how the CIA and KGB did it during the Cold War, and carried on to how Russia is doing political warfare in contemporary activities. And Creating Chaos is the newest book and definitely has the broadest coverage of covert action.
You had mentioned quite a few different sources for your information. Now, before we get into the specifics, tell everybody how you collected that information. Are you talking about leaked documents? Are you talking about Freedom of Information Act stuff? Somebody handed it to you in a dark garage somewhere? How did you get the information?
This is almost, in the early days, I have to say, the information was almost all out of the National Archives. And it was all out of materials that have been obtained through the JFK collections, and that grew over the decades. But the only way to get it was to go to the archives and print out things. And interestingly, I had a friend, Anna Marie Kunz-Walko, whose husband was in the Air Force, and she was stationed in the D.C. area, and she had spent years going to the archives and building her own private paper collection, thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. And fortunately, I was able to use her files and go through her files and copy them. From then on, things became easier because we began getting records releases through the JFK Acts, through FOIA, and obviously, as you well know, material began to go online. Yeah. So in more recent years, there's I still do a lot of FOIA, but have been able to do a lot of what I do today, quite frankly, with the books that I just mentioned, I don't think could have been done before data mining with the online resources of the Black Vault, of Mary Farrell Foundation, the National Security Archives. It's just, there's no way we could have done this sort of thing even 20 years ago. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the compliment and adding the Black Vault in there. I really do. Let me ask you about those early days when you were at the National Archives. A very quick note for me. I've been to the National Archives, not only in College Park, but a few branches. And it is an amazing experience. For those listening in, if you love anything about history, I highly recommend that you go to these either presidential libraries or the main National Archives branch. But Larry, when you were there, X amount of years ago and doing this research and getting into CIA and assassinations and a lot of these documents, were they hard for you to obtain? Was this like they're hiding it in plain sight? I mean, talk to us about the process of digging through in those early days of your research, digging through these boxes. I mean, was it laborious?
A lot of it was, if you will, hidden in plain sight is a good way to describe it because of the way that the documents are indexed. Mm-hmm. In many cases, you really have no clue what's in a given document. You may have had a vague idea of what time frame it was covered, what office generated it, but the only way to find out what was in it was to go through it page by page. Yeah. And I think two fascinating things that, if you haven't worked with these documents, that struck me was many times documents were interfiled, and documents that should never have been released, or at least pages of documents, had been released and interfiled in places they shouldn't have been. Yeah. And that was some of the most interesting material when you ran across something that was clearly not intended to have been released. Yeah. The other fascinating thing for those who've never looked at the CIA, nowadays we have projects where we have been able to identify crypts and aliases for hundreds of operations and hundreds of people. In the early days, we didn't know that, but the fun thing was that even in CIA documents, they're intended to confuse the other guys, the Soviets, but crypts are used so widely that the people using them sometimes had to make their own notes on them. Mm-hmm. So you would see a crypt, and then in handwriting by it, you would see what it really meant. The real name, the real operation. And that was the real blockbuster. It's kind of like, oh, wow, now we know something.
Going through these archives, I think you really come to the conclusion, researcher or not, come to the conclusion that the United States government doesn't even know what they have. And I remember I pulled a box and I was researching something, and I remember opening up the envelopes. And again, for those who have never done this before, when you pull these archive boxes, it's kind of it's a surprise every time you open it, because what's on the label or what's on the index is, like you said, Larry, not necessarily what's inside. And I remember one of the first boxes I ever opened, one of my first experiences I ever had, was opening something, and a bunch of Third Reich Nazi paperwork fell out. And that was not part of what I was doing, but all of this, pictures and work papers and passports, all with the swastika stamps and so on and so forth. And again, it was a testament to, they just don't know what they have, and what is on the label is not necessarily what's inside. And it really is, from a historical standpoint, an amazing thing to do, to go through some of these boxes and see that. So let's start digging into your research and talk to me a little bit about what exactly is then the CIA's connection to political assassinations. How far back does it go?
Well, the CIA actually, I would say we now know that political assassination on an individual basis, not talking about executive action or, acts against presidents or government leaders, really started right at the end of World War II in Berlin and Japan. Mm-hmm. And when the OSS was still in existence and Army counterintelligence was taking over, Berlin and Japan were active post-war points of conflict between communist agents and American agents or Western agents. And we really do see evidence of Army counterintelligence working with local people and literally taking out communist spies, people they considered communist spies or communist agents, quite in terms of dozens at least, in Berlin and in Japan. And they really looked at this as, you might consider it the first stage in the Cold War or the last stage in World War II. But that was kind of the genesis of political assassination within the American intelligence community, and that was in counterintelligence, military counterintelligence.
Mm-hmm.
The CIA, of course, really did not get organized and become operational until 1947, 1948, and that was not an immediate task for the CIA. It began with intelligence collection,
mm-hmm.
but under President Truman at the end of the decade and under President Eisenhower, the CIA began to be tasked with covert action. And that was not necessarily political assassination, but it came up in almost every operation.
Mm-hmm.
And we run into things like the term blacklisting becomes common in the documents. And what blacklisting means is that CIA officers would help the surrogate people that they were working with, the revolutionaries, the regime change agents, identify people within the regimes that were going to be overthrown that should be eliminated
mm-hmm.
as part of the process. And this was, again, not political leaders, local leaders, party leaders, but to some extent it's the same sort of thing that the KGB was doing in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there an official document or line or rhyme or reason on why the CIA began doing this and getting involved?
Yes, and actually we do have extensive documents. The first place we find it is in Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
In PB Success was the operation, and we actually have the documents that show the discussions between the State Department and the CIA, between the CIA and the field officers that were involved in it. And it actually discusses assassination at quite length. It discusses the preparation of assassination manuals for training the revolutionary military. It discusses targeting. It discusses fear campaigns based on assassination. So it's well documented, and a lot of this was exposed by the Church Committee
mm-hmm.
in the 1970s. So we do have those documents. In other instances, you've really got to dig for it. In recent years, we've come across the same thing in regard to Cuba, and that was much harder to find. And actually, the Church Committee didn't find that, but by having the JFK Records Act, the JFK Release Act, we see a lot of CIA documents in regard to Cuba, and in particular in regard to something called Operation 40,
mm-hmm.
which was it was a blacklist effort, and if the Bay of Pigs had succeeded, it would have spawned a series of eliminations inside Cuba.
Do you see a difference as you go through these documents, especially with this particular topic? Do you see a difference between the documents that were written and created prior to the passing of the Freedom of Information Act versus after the passing of the Freedom of Information Act? You see a difference there?
Not in regard to this. I see a difference, and
mm-hmm.
the difference really occurs, I would say, post-JFK.
Mm-hmm.
During the Truman administration, in the Eisenhower administration, and even into the first year or so of the JFK administration, the CIA was obviously working on an internal model where this wasn't necessarily forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just standard operating practice. So you find documents openly discussing it. And you see that not only in CIA documents, but in State Department documents.
Mm-hmm.
However, beginning with during the late 1960s and into the 1970s, it becomes much more vague. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
It may be, you can see it's happening, but nobody is talking about it the way they were. And as a matter of fact, you can actually see what's going on. I've seen documents, field office documents, which are, if you get to field office documents, it really tells you what's going on. And they're documents which essentially say, all right, folks, we've got to stop reporting this to headquarters in Washington because they don't like to see us talking about this. So from now on, we're going to talk about these operations either verbally or in what is called soft files. And soft files are what you keep in your desk drawer and what you don't copy back to headquarters.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what's interesting for me. And again, with this, I'm surprised to hear you say you don't really see a huge difference. But the passing of the Freedom of Information Act, in my opinion, really changed the way some of these documents were written, because all of a sudden you can now start pushing to access them and start pushing to get them declassified. What also surprises me, and let me ask you this, does it surprise you that you can still get these documents, meaning they haven't been destroyed or covered up or still considered top secret? I mean, political assassinations, that's kind of a big deal when when the government has taken part in them. What are your thoughts on that we can actually still access at least some of these records?
I think it gets back to something that you said just a few minutes ago. In many cases, and here's the difference, I think, to address what you're talking about. Before FOIA, before Freedom of Information, and before the 1960s, you see this sort of discussion in State Department documents. You see it in CIA planning documents. And then after that point in time, you don't find it there. But where you do find it is in these station records, the CIA station records, or the State Department field files, embassy files. So to some extent, I think it's a matter of them not realizing what is where. It's kind of like, okay, we're going to scrub the headquarters files, and this is not going to appear there, and then they kind of forget that it may show up buried inside another file somewhere where you have to read 20 pages to even see that it's mentioned.
Yeah.
And they just literally don't know. You can control part of the information, but there are bits and pieces, and you can't clean it all up. There's still enough for us to find now that we can do data mining.
Yeah.
Before the data mining, before the search tools that we have now online, I'm not sure you would have ever found it just looking at the paper files.
Yeah. And there are a massive amount of paper files. And again, just to kind of give a quick note out there for the listeners, when you do go to the National Archives, they generally will gauge the amount of paper they have on a particular subject by the amount of cubic feet, not the number of pages. And even those numbers are very large. So to give everybody an idea of how much information is really there, and how digitizing a lot of this material, and it still is a very small percentage, but how digitizing it really does help historical research like Larry has been doing. Now, Larry, with these documents and the CIA's involvement in some of this stuff, who, in your opinion, was making these decisions? I mean, who was authorizing these types of operations?
That gets to be sort of surprising in a way, because as it turns out, a lot of the recommendations for what ended up as political, especially executive actions, actions to take out a nation's leader. Let's talk about taking out Fidel Castro or Patrice Lumumba. Actually, start within the State Department, or started within the State Department, which was surprising to me. And they start within the State Department, and they start within the CIA. A senior officer will. It's interesting to find it in the documents itself. I found an instance where a CIA officer, J.C. King, who was in charge of the Western Hemisphere, wrote a memo internally which said, literally, we need to eliminate Castro. And he sends it to his boss, Richard Helms, and Helms takes it to President Eisenhower and simply removes the eliminate and says, we need to deal with Fidel Castro. But everybody knows what they're really saying, and President Eisenhower approves the project. But they don't start generally down within the CIA. They start at very senior level and for the executive action programs like Lumumba and Castro, or later on against Gaddafi or bin Laden, those really do start with the president. And the president gives the directive, and the CIA just follows the marching orders. They may kind of push the president in a given direction, but it is the president that gives the orders.
And by what you just said, so are you saying that even to this day, the CIA is taking part in these types of assassinations or these plots?
As far as leaders, we know, well, actually a change. And we see a major change in roles post 9/11. And post 9/11, what we really saw under President Bush, under his Secretary of Defense, was that the role of the CIA, especially in what you would call targeting and political assassination, was moved from the CIA to the military. And it was moved to the Joint Special Operations Command. CIA still was involved in terms of information collections, but basically the military, this was became regarded as less of a political action and more a, whatever you want to call it, act of self-defense, anti-terrorism. But you actually see the military asked to take over the job, rather than, if it were Eisenhower, he would have gone to the CIA. If it's Bush, or Trump, by the way, he goes to the military. As we have recently seen, apparently President Trump went to his Secretary of Defense and wanted to take out Assad. And, in a number of these occasions, it's interesting. You can actually find the documents that reveal this change, because when President Clinton wanted to take out bin Laden, at that time bin Laden was in Sudan, Clinton went to the CIA and said, well, okay, I want you to eliminate him. He's a threat. And the CIA said, well, we don't do that. We don't have any resources. We don't have any assets. You need to talk to the military. And so he called in the military, and ultimately the military tried to get bin Laden with cruise missiles, because they themselves couldn't figure out a way to pull off an operation in the Sudan. But I know that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's okay.
The role has really changed in the last couple of decades, and we find JSOC playing the lead. They get target list, they get threat list, and CIA has moved into an intelligence collection and what you might call a targeting role. And we see that in the bin Laden mission. The bin Laden mission, which in the earlier days, you would just have given it to the CIA and they would have organized the military assets and done it covertly. And that, although legally it was a legal title operation under the CIA purely was in a support role for intelligence collection.
There's a lot behind that bin Laden story that I don't, and you're more knowledgeable than me, but there's a lot behind that story that I don't think is public on how they were able to do this operation. On that, and I wish I was a little more prepared for this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I recall hearing rumors that even though it was military personnel that undertook the operation to go in and get bin Laden, that there was some kind of legal workaround that they had to make sure that it wasn't a quote-unquote military operation. Now, again, that's not a very intelligent question, so I apologize, because I don't know the specifics, and I don't even know if the specifics are known. But does that make sense? Do you recall hearing that, or was this just a bona fide military mission with CIA support?
No, you're absolutely correct. Unfortunately, I wrote about that fairly extensively in Shadow Warfare, because that reflects this change. I mean, basically, there are two sets of legal code: Title 10 and Title 50. The CIA operates off one, which is basically within the National Security Legal Code that originated in 1947. And it's a set of legal code that grants them the ability to do things that nobody else can do.
Yeah.
Basically, they can perform illegal actions. They can do things you can't do under military code or civil code.
Yeah.
And the bin Laden mission was authorized under that code so we could basically go kill somebody.
Yeah.
But the military, you're not in a state of war, you're not in a state of declared war, but the CIA operates under legal code which literally says you are always at a state of war.
Yeah. It's a fact.
And I try to elaborate. It gets pretty complex, but I spend a whole chapter in Shadow Warfare on that.
Yeah. Because
that reflects this big difference the role reversal that I'm talking about, and that's actually where we came up with the title Shadow Warfare, because this is the new style of covert warfare, not the old Cold War era, but the anti-terrorism contemporary covert warfare.
There's a lot of interesting stuff, and it's fascinating to really start dissecting it because, again, I don't think the general public is made aware. And I've spent a lot of time filing FOIAs, a lot of which come up with dead ends. But how much they had to twist the law to make this all happen. And like you said, they had to do quite a bit to make all of this work. And I've still got open FOIA requests that have gone on for years now, trying to figure out what kind of cooperation, if any, did other countries give as support for this, or did we just go in? I believe the company line, pardon the pun, is the fact that they just kind of went in and, it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission, that kind of a thing. But it really is something that still to this day with the bin Laden story, we're being stonewalled on exactly how this happened. So I appreciate you kind of diving in on that because I wanted to pick your brain on bin Laden. But let me kind of back up a little bit. We know how that operation came about, at least a little bit anyway. Who was taking part in these assassinations decades ago when the CIA really was the front for these operations? Who was going out and pulling the trigger, so to speak, or literally?
And literally. Again, interestingly enough, and there's a big difference between the way the Soviet Union did it and the way the United States did it. The Soviet Union often, especially in Europe, used its own KGB agents under direct control. The United States, I'm not sure I can find a single evident instance of where they did that. They always used surrogates because the two nations approached the whole covert operations from a different standpoint. The United States always approached everything under the concept of deniability. In other words, we might do it, but we use a third party. We use a surrogate. Nothing's ever in writing. We don't issue any orders to them to do anything, certainly not in writing. And if they go ahead and do it, it's not our fault. You find that in the Church Committee investigation and in many instances where the CIA says, well, yes, there was an assassination, and yes, it was somebody that we were working with, but we really didn't tell them to do it. They just did it. Now, they might have used weapons that we had provided. They might have used explosives that we had provided, but nobody ever told them to do that. And it's somewhat farcical, but that's the reality of the situation. From a Soviet perspective, they would just do it and then literally deny it.
Yeah.
It's like we just, no, it wasn't us, even if it looks like us. We would be, well, it's somebody we know, but we really didn't tell them.
I just want to jump in and clarify. So when you say surrogate, are you talking about, and if you have an example off the top of your head, that'd be even better. But by a surrogate, do you mean like they're finding an asset in the country that they're looking to, assassinate somebody on the political spectrum, or a surrogate that's American and they take them over there and kind of help them out do this? Like, what exactly do you mean by that?
A non-American.
Okay.
In many instances, let's say that we're talking about Latin America or we're talking about Cuba, it would be a revolutionary group.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, an expatriate or an expatriate group, someone that the CIA is already involved with regime change.
Okay.
And so bottom line, in Guatemala or Cuba, we would be working with a Guatemalan exile, ex-Guatemalan military. In Cuba, it would be a Cuban exile. And we would be working with them in regime change activities, trying to oust the current regime that we didn't like. And as part of that operation, they would attempt to conduct assassinations, either of political leaders or especially this occurred repeatedly with Fidel Castro. But these would be people that we're doing regime change with, and that's across the board in virtually any country where we're trying to oust or bring down a regime.
Mm-hmm.
The other alternative is that we actually, in some occasions, used criminal figures. They would be non-Americans, generally speaking. They would be people that the CIA had spotted. For example, with Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, we used Belgian citizens that we had spotted and been using for activities in Europe. And because they had Belgian passports, it was easy for them to get into the Congo and take in poison that they were going to try to use to poison Patrice Lumumba. Same thing in Cuba. We used ex-gambling Havana casino figures to carry in poison to try to kill Castro. So the surrogates would either be revolutionaries or some type of criminal faction that the CIA was familiar with, and those would be who I would be talking about as surrogates.
During your research, is there someone that sticks out as being kind of the most surprising that you learned the CIA had a role in taking out? Successful.
Surprising. I think the surprising thing is that just the opposite. The surprising thing is that they tried on so many occasions and generally failed. Considering the effort and the resources they put into political assassination, especially executive actions against Castro, for example, and he survived them all, it's really sort of amazing. Where you find that they were successful, it was usually at a much lower level where one of the surrogates that I was talking about took out a colonel or a general that was a regime leader. Chile would be an example of that in the 70s, where people that the CIA, revolutionaries the CIA was working with, did manage to kill a leading general that was in support of the regime, and with him gone, actually the CIA managed to encourage a revolution, which did change the regime. But I think that would be the surprising thing that strikes me, is that so often they tried to take out key leaders like bin Laden or like Gaddafi, and were not able to bring it off either with covert assassinations or even military attacks. There's no doubt that President Reagan in the military strike on Libya wanted to kill Gaddafi.
Yeah. Absolutely
no doubt. And they just weren't able to pull off the targeting to do it. And you see the same thing with bin Laden over and over again. It's not as easy as one might think.
Yeah. And with your experience looking through these documents on the successful ones, obviously they had a lot of failures, but with the successful ones, how much of a role over the last 50, 60 years did the CIA, or just the government as a whole, how much of a role did they play in shaping the world. Do you think that these operations really drastically altered our history?
I can think of only 2 instances where you would really consider them immediately to have been successful. And the CIA and Washington considered them to have been successful operations that actually changed the regime and made a difference. And that would have been Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And in both instances, that lasted for, perhaps a decade, and it left a legacy of anti-Americanism that we suffer through today, as everybody knows. I mean, in most cases, these regime change operations were so obvious, even though they were supposed to be deniable, sort of like Cuba. Everybody knew who was behind it, and even when a regime was replaced, as in Chile or Guatemala, you ended up with a dictator who was so brutal that the legacy was anti-Americanism. So it's very hard to... The only place that you can see, and again, it's primarily in Latin America, where we supported dictatorships rather than changing them, basically through the span of the Cold War, and this is an opinion, obviously, it really didn't... The government didn't really matter as long as they said they were pro-America. We supported them. Wow. What they were doing otherwise didn't count. And we managed to maintain a lot of very vicious dictatorships in power simply because they said they liked us. And that was not necessarily successful in the long run. Again, as I say, especially in Latin America, in the southern cone nations, Ecuador, and left this terrible legacy of death squads and hostility that it's unclear when we'll ever overcome.
Wow. And is there any, I hate to say positive, so I'm wording this question wrong, but was there anything positive to be gained from these political assassinations? It sounds like you've mentioned quite a few negative things, including failures, anti-Americanism now rampant in many different countries. Was there any benefit to what they did?
I've had that question asked before, and I honestly, even for the ones that they considered successful, I can't find any long-term benefit because the long-term consequences were always negative. And sometimes, I mean, if you look at some place like Laos, where the CIA was in charge of a massive military operation, I would have to say, if you want to be totally objective and talk about effectiveness, with the CIA in charge of covert operations, it was hardly ever successful, and in general, they didn't work. In terms of actually being successful, the military has been more successful in this new generation of shadow warfare and actually killing terrorists, eliminating them. Now, the consequences of that are debatable, but you can't argue that they haven't been more successful and probably with less collateral damage. I mean, I hate to say that, but compared to what the legacy that the CIA left in South America and across the Middle East and in Africa, it's hard to do worse than that.
Wow. I know in addition to the political assassinations and the connection to the CIA and the military, you've investigated quite a bit on other aspects of the covert operations of the CIA. Tell me about what some of the other shady covert ops that the CIA has done in the past. That really, so basically so far we talked about political assassination and we've talked about regime change, which are the two most obvious, the most sensational, the things that get talked about the most. Now, the place that the CIA was probably most successful, well, I mean, it was most successful in intelligence collection. If you just let them do what they were supposed to do in the first place, they've been quite successful. As an intelligence collection, espionage, they do that quite well. It's these operations, covert operations, that they were not very successful in. But
the political warfare. For example, they were relatively successful in Europe post-war in terms of, and a lot of this is what I cover in Creating Chaos. They were successful in preventing communist government takeovers in Italy and France. Whether you might have your own opinion, but the bottom line is their political operations did prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably the very first fear after the end of the World War II, was that both France and Italy would become communist.
Mm-hmm.
And that came very close. And those were the first agency political action operations. They were successful. There are other places that you would consider them pretty successful. Even in Latin America, the CIA was very active and very successful in Mexico. Write about that at length in Creating Chaos. And in a couple of other nations where Cuba was very influential
mm-hmm.
and very active in pursuing communist revolutions. Actually, surprisingly enough, the Soviet Union was very active in Mexico, even to the extent of organizing, training, and arming revolutionary groups inside Mexico. And the CIA was very successful with active measures and political action in Mexico opposing that. So those would be examples. They were less successful in Eastern Europe. I would say probably the most successful political action at the time, looking successful though, appeared to be in Afghanistan, mm-hmm. where the CIA worked with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in political action activities against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And at the time, that was deemed to be amazingly successful, yet now we know that it bred a lot Islamic terrorism and decades. So some of these are, I guess the reason I'm introducing that is that successful and not successful is relative over what time span you're looking at it. It can look really good for a year or two or for a decade, and then you go, wait a minute, that didn't really do what we thought it was going to do. In fact, it did something a lot worse. But they were, I would say overall, they were much more successful with political action, which involves supporting regimes and supporting regimes that you're in favor of, much more successful in regime support than regime change.
And with the example you gave with Afghanistan, does this play into kind of the whole, and I don't think it's a rumor, I think it is more factual, but you correct me on that, of when we were sending arms over there, that we ultimately were arming bin Laden at the time? Is that more conspiracy, or is that more documented?
What happened is well documented now. Again, primarily from State Department. I think one of the fascinating things about all this is I learned that if you really want to find out what the CIA was doing, the CIA won't tell you, but the State Department was always happy to document it.
Yeah.
Because they generally opposed it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, if you want to find out where CIA sins are, look in State Department documents, and if you want to find out where State Department sins are, look in CIA documents. It's kind of like the agencies collect a lot of intelligence on each other. Mm-hmm. But to answer your question, to cut to the chase on that, the decision was made, again, in pursuit of deniability, that we would provide the money, we would provide weapons, but we would have no operational involvement in what went on in Afghanistan. We would leave that entirely to the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis were intent on ousting the Soviets, but what they were really intent in doing was creating an Islamic buffer state between themselves and Russia. Their interest was not really our interest, and because the CIA really stepped back and let them take control, they created an Islamic jihad. Now, bin Laden went to Pakistan, and bin Laden routed a lot of Saudi money through Pakistan to this jihad. So I think it's kind of unfair to say that we gave it to bin Laden. What we allowed bin Laden and the Saudi regime, for that matter, not just bin Laden, was to route huge amounts of their own money, plus huge amounts of our money to Pakistan and run the operations. And things got so bad that we were not even allowed, we couldn't do training, we couldn't send CI officers into the camps. We had no idea what the Pakistanis were really doing with this Islamic Jihad until the reports began to come back that the non-Islamists in Afghanistan, the revolutionary groups, were essentially being wiped out by these Arab Islamists, and they started complaining. But things were going so well and so many Russians were being killed that nobody wanted to say this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And when the CIA tried to slip agents in, they were actually either killed or threatened or driven out of the country. And it was only at the very end that it became apparent how badly we'd messed up. So that's kind of, the basic statement is true. Did we support what became an Islamic Jihad? Yeah, we did. But we really didn't do it knowingly. We got, once again, sucked into this whole concept of deniability, which virtually always goes bad.
Yeah. I don't think there's any good that you've brought up, Larry. I'm really depressed about our government now.
You have to ask, kind of like, why did you write just one more book on this? Or were you looking for something good? You're never going to find it.
Yeah, that book is 3 pages long, and that's it on the good stuff. But let me kind of shift gears a little bit here in the last 10 minutes. The hour's just kind of flown by, but I definitely want to now ask you some questions because I know you've written extensively about the JFK assassination. And obviously a long-standing rumor that is no surprise to anybody is that the United States government played a role in it, namely the CIA and so on. With the documents that you've brought forward, you have kind of a blueprint to an assassination. And you've brought up another thing that I want to kind of remind the audience that you had mentioned that the government has enlisted the surrogates and sometimes members of a crime family or a criminal of some sort to kind of undertake these types of really dark operations. My questions to you now, shifting towards the JFK assassination, do you find a connection between all these verified documents, all of these verified incidents where the CIA has played a role, or at least tried to play a role, in a political assassination? Do you find a connection between all of that and the theory that they possibly played a role in the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Unfortunately, I do. And I developed that in Nexus in a pretty focused fashion. I introduced it in a book called Someone Would Have Talked about the Kennedy assassination, but after I did that book, what dawned on me is just what you said, that obviously what we see in the Kennedy assassination is on the model of what we see in a great number of the CIA-incited surrogate attacks. And that is what I really find in regard to the JFK assassination. And using the documents that we have available now, we can pretty well dial it down to something that looks exactly like a surrogate tactical operation, executive action operation, and most specifically trace it back to the same people that the CIA had trained and was preparing for and attempted attacks on Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
One of the things that's come out of the documents most recently is a super secret project that the Church Committee knew nothing about. And strangely enough, we learned about it not through the CIA we learned about it through some former CIA employees who had gone to work for the National Photographic Interpretation Center. And when the House Select Committee conducted their hearings, these people came forward and reported their work on a Castro assassination project, which involved sending snipers in for an attack on Fidel Castro during travel to his estate, his retreat in an area of Cuba. And apparently, this was a very serious operation. They did satellite imaging, they did mapping, they even pre-configured the rifles for exactly the range of the attack. And this was something that's been entirely unknown until, again, just the last few years when we began to dig into these documents.
Mm-hmm.
And so in response to your question, I think what we've been able to trace in Dallas goes back to a very specific group of CIA officers and Cuban exiles who had been involved in operations to kill Fidel Castro, essentially being retargeted on JFK because he had begun back-channel negotiations with Castro in the fall of 1963.
Wow. And I can say that I've filed some FOIA requests. I want to throw a name out there to you because I've talked about it, talked about this person in the past here on the radio show. But Johnny Roselli has been a name that has come up, and I know that he was kind of connected to potentially that assassination plan for Castro, and his name is kind of now entwined in possibly having a role in JFK's assassination. Now, just a very quick note to those listening, and maybe you missed the past references, but Roselli has files that extend tens of thousands of pages off the top of my head, most of which have never been out before. They're not part of the JFK collection, the JFK assassination collection. Does that name, I know the name rings a bell, but when you mentioned people that were kind of being trained for this, did it involve members of the mafia and criminal, or was it just Cuban exiles and CIA operatives?
Initially, it involved former Havana casino gambling figures who Roselli knew of, and it evolved over a couple of year period, but the key names, as you said, are Johnny Roselli, William Harvey from the CIA side, and David Morales from the CIA operations side at JM Wave, because he was the operations manager at JM Wave. And so those are the three people that were, by 1962, 1963, had been involved in the kind of the second phase of the attempts to kill Castro. The first phase had been with poison, and the second phase appears to have been with sniper teams. So Roselli comes into play because he's part of that group that has been organized by the CIA to kill Castro. I would say that it's one of those things that changed very rapidly over a course of 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. You almost have to track it month by month as to who's involved and how things are going operationally, and I do that in Nexus. But one question I would ask, and one of the things I'm searching for, we have obtained literally thousands of pages of FBI surveillance documents on Roselli. Mm-hmm. The one thing that we haven't been able to find is the FBI field office files out of Miami on Roselli surveillance. Those appear to have disappeared utterly. We see them monitoring in Los Angeles and in Vegas, but Miami seems to be gone. That's an outstanding interest of mine in case you ever see them.
Yeah. So this is something I think you and I might want to continue off the air, but let me ask you on the air. So you're saying the Roselli files that are known have all been released before?
The FBI surveillance files. The
surveillance files. Okay. Then I'm going to have to double check, because I recall about a year or two ago, there were, the FBI told me that there were literally thousands and thousands of files that I had to pay for, which meant that they didn't fit into the pre-processed category, which led me to believe from talks with them that they had never been out before. So I want to cross-reference that, and maybe you and I will be having another conversation, not only off the air, but maybe on a later show, because maybe that is something to raise money. I was playing with the idea to kind of crowdfund it because it was just an insane amount of money. But according to the FBI, they had told me that again, through conversation, that those had never been released before. So
and that'll be a great thing to check, because we got ours on. A friend of mine got it on CD, and I have to, as you can say, with this number of books, that'll take me back 3 or 4 years or 5 years, and say, okay, let's try to reset that button and find out what happened.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely be doing a follow-up then on that, and I'll cross-reference, my past request and kind of see if it matches up to what you guys got, and maybe they're just trying to, double dip and get multiple payments from the public, or maybe these are something that they recently found. But I can, if I could add one thing on that, and I think this is, again, something we have found most recently. Perhaps the most frightening thing about this is we have found evidence in files, federal files, that the CIA itself and even the president suspected that CIA officers might have been involved in the Kennedy assassination. We found evidence of a national security meeting that was held on Sunday after the assassination, which occurred simply, literally 2 hours before the FBI shut down their investigation totally and decided to write, and were ordered to write a report that it was Lee Oswald only. We have also found details of a CIA investigation at their JM Wave station in Miami that looking into the fact that Cubans were involved, and that we know that was investigated. We know the details of the questions that were asked. We know that a report was generated and the report disappeared. So I think the most frightening thing of all of this is that after the assassination of President Kennedy, there may not have been an investigation because it got to the point where it was something that nobody wanted to find. Yeah. Now, as we approach the end of the hour, I want to ask you one last thing. You had mentioned earlier that some of that anti-Americanism that spawned in some of these countries that the CIA was doing, these covert operations, as kind of the fallout for them doing such assassinations and, again, covert ops. You said that kind of was spawned because it was so obvious that the CIA was involved and the American government was involved. My takeaway from the last hour with you and hearing about the history of all these different countries, a lot of which you don't hear every day in the history books, in universities and grade school, which I think is a different show in itself. But that being said, you said it was so obvious to these other countries. When I walk away from this 1 hour with you, and I could talk to you all day, it seems that blueprint of these assassinations, it is so obvious when you just take the blueprint of some of these operations that the CIA undertook in other countries, just switch the blueprint and plop it into Dallas. And that blueprint fits perfectly, and it becomes very obvious that the CIA played a role in this. I know you've already answered that you do believe they played a role, but am I walking away with the right impression that you feel this is kind of a blueprint? This isn't a guess. They actually had this spelled out for Castro, and they just kind of changed the name, and poof, you have Dallas. Am I misunderstanding?
No, absolutely. No, you're not. I would say my take on it is not only was it was down to the tactical level. It matches all the. If you read William Harvey's, and actually he left us the documents when he was ordered to set up an executive action program and which he applied to Castro, one of the things in his notes, it calls for using a patsy, and it calls for using a patsy who will be attributable to the Russians. Wow. And if you go through his set of notes, it's like, okay, we're going to do this. It doesn't have to, it can be kind of obvious, but to divert people, there's got to be a name associated that will lead folks to the Russians. Mm-hmm. And they will get so muddled up in the Russian connection that everybody will forget. It'll be misdirection, classic misdirection. Yeah. And when you see that and you think of Lee Oswald, it's hard to go, wait a minute, somebody just, here's the script.
Yeah. I guess the blueprint is even more detailed than I thought, but I'm glad I asked the question because, look, I'm fascinated by that topic, and I'm a firm believer that a lot of times we won't have an answer to a certain topic. And this is true with CIA, assassination plots and the assassination of JFK, but a lot of different topics and secrets within the United States government, the United States military. I've said for years that in order to understand something that may end in a question mark for us, we need to look in the past, and the past will help us fill in the blanks and fill in the holes because history tends to repeat itself. And I think with your interview and talking to you and your books, and I highly recommend everybody to check them out because they're thoroughly researched, as you all can tell, it is the past that helps us understand some of these still unanswered questions. And it's that hiding in plain sight that you've been able to take all of that information and paint these amazing pictures. So definitely check out. Here's the 3 books dealing with what we've talked about, the majority anyway, in this interview. Nexus, Shadow Warfare, and Creating Chaos. The author, Larry Hancock. You can visit him online, www.larry-hancock.com. That's LARRY-HANCOCK.com. You can check out all the books, and all of the information that we've talked about here on the Black Vault Radio will all be linked from my show notes page. You can also get all of the order forms for Larry's books and learn about some that we haven't even talked about. I'll bring them back. We could talk about the UFO book Unidentified that he wrote, and quite a few other more fascinating books that he's got under his label. So you can check out the show notes page and all of those links at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. You are listening to episode number 12. Scroll down, find that, and all of the links will be there. Larry, you're an encyclopedia of knowledge and history. I really do appreciate your time and joining me on the Black Vault Radio today.
I appreciate it. It was a pleasure, even if it's somewhat depressing.
Well, I was joking when I said that, but I really, this type of history needs to be known, and we learn from it. And if it was a mistake, we learn from that. If it was something of benefit, then, it might be a dark part of our history, but history nonetheless. But that being said, you are definitely welcome back anytime. I know that I will be sending you an invite to come back, talk about some of your other titles. But again, thank you for your time.
You bet. Sounds good.
Although that concludes my interview with Mr. Larry Hancock, don't go away. Coming up, a recently discovered batch of documents are explored. They detail one of the most well-known pilot UFO encounters of all time. For the past 17 years, I was told by the U.S. government these were all destroyed. I finally uncovered they were wrong. That's coming up on TBV Unredacted. On this episode's TBV Unredacted, I want to profile one of many documents that just came out that were previously thought destroyed. Now, you may or may not have seen me post this here in the last week, but this is an incredibly important find, especially when it comes to UFO history. Now, this involves Japanese Airlines Flight 1628. Now, I want to give the brief synopsis of this particular case. There are a lot of details in this. This is a very well-known UFO case. It's been around for a long time, even longer than I've been involved in UFO research. But it's something that I believe is definitely credible in the sense that this was a pilot. In fact, the whole crew saw these UFOs. This was a Japanese Airlines flight number 1628, and the encounter occurred on November 17th, 1986. Now, this was a flight that, during its leg off the coast of Alaska, saw 2 UFOs out to the left of this guy's aircraft. They were transporting wine, and again, they were inbound to Anchorage, I believe the flight was heading to. And this pilot sees these multiple UFOs. It was confirmed on radar, at least on one or two systems that I know of. And it really has been a very widely known UFO case, referenced in quite a few different books. Again, on the internet is rampant with stories about 1628. So this is something that, again, is not anything new when it comes to the case. The sighting itself lasted for 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. Near an hour that this crew, specifically the pilot, was watching these multiple UFOs. He sees at least three. The third one that he sees is a much larger, what he described as a disc-shaped object, and these UFOs started trailing his aircraft. They started following him. So when he landed and started talking about what happened to him, and this was on the radio as well, through the communications. This was not something that he came out with after the fact. This was something that was on the air traffic control recordings, and those recordings have been available. So this was something that definitely happened, confirmed on radar. He lands. The FAA takes a huge interest in this. Any near encounter with another craft is a big problem with them. That's the whole root of why air traffic control exists, is they want to make sure that there are no issues in the air. And so when there's this close encounter, UFO, quote-unquote UFO or not, the FAA took a great interest in this. So back in 2001, so let's fast forward. So we know the FAA did an investigation on this. Some of the documents have surfaced in the past, and they have been written about in various books and online articles and so on. So let's fast forward from 1986 to 2001. I was doing the Black Vault at this point for about 5 years. And I had known about Flight 1628. I decided to file a FOIA request to the FAA for all records specifically on this particular incident. Now, this out of the 9,000 Freedom of Information Act requests that I have filed, and that does not include the follow-up letters. Those are just the cases. 9,000 cases that I have filed from 1996 to the date of me recording this. I've never had this happen. The FAA responded and said that they considered me what's called a commercial requester. And they said, in order for me to get the 107 pages of records that pertain to Japan Airlines Flight 1628, if I wanted to get those, in order to circumvent the fees that were involved with being a commercial requester, that I would need to withdraw my FOIA request, and they would send them to me for free. Now, what is a fee category? There's three when you file a Freedom of Information Act request. One is called a non-commercial. The second is commercial. The third is news media. At the time in 2001, I was considered a non-commercial requester. Most agencies accepted that and would process my requests accordingly. The FAA, for whatever reason, put me in the commercial category on this particular request. I don't know why, and there was no reason for me at the time to fight it, because they said that they were going to give me the documents for free. So I sent that letter of retraction via email. I do now have it all posted, but you can see they said if you can email us, we'll go ahead once on receipt, retract your request, send you the 107 pages for free. I can tell you out of the 9,000 requests that has never happened before. There is no policy, no procedure, no manual, no law, no amendment, no nothing that says a government agency can ask a requester to withdraw a request to circumvent fees and they would get it for free. In retrospect, I totally regret the decision I made. Number one, of not fighting the commercial status at the time, because the FAA does not consider me a commercial requester to this day. So I regret not fighting it, but I regret withdrawing the request, because the minute you withdraw the request, you have no legal standing anymore to appeal, request status on your request, really do anything when you don't have a FOIA request or case number to reference. So I emailed in and withdrew my request. Now, here's the weird thing about their letter. This also, in 9,000 requests, has never happened before. They said, if we don't hear from you within 30 days of the date of this letter, we will destroy the 107 pages of responsive records. Now, I've never seen that. Every agency has what's called a records retention schedule. All agencies vary with the records that they retain, but what a records retention schedule is it outlines what records they keep and for how long. And if they are going to destroy something, how long has to elapse, how much time has to elapse for the agency to be able to legally destroy the records. Now, a lot of records are mostly not destroyed. Many of them are transferred over to the National Archives or their own agency historical branches or, whatever. But generally, they're not destroyed. There are groups of pages that are, sadly. In this day and age, I don't agree with any of that. Documents should never be destroyed, but be that as it may, they are. But never is it spelled out that I've ever been able to find that if you don't respond to a FOIA request in a certain amount of time, they'll just destroy the responsive records. That's not defined anywhere, and yet the FAA pulled that with me on this specific request. Well, I followed up months later, and this specific person, Jean Mahoney from the FAA at the time, I don't believe she's still there. I could be wrong. I'm not trying to point the finger at her, so please don't send her any hate mail, but it is a matter of public record that she was the one that sent me this letter. And she said on my follow-up asking, hey, withdrew the request. I haven't heard from you. It's been quite a few months. They said they did not hear from me within 30 days, and they destroyed the 107 pages. Now, you can expect that that was a very disheartening thing for me to hear, because I know I did. I know that I sent that email. Now, this was 17 years ago, quite a few computers ago. Technology has changed quite a bit. That specific system sadly had a hard drive crash, and I wasn't using what's called IMAP, so my emails now for many, many, many years are not stored on a local drive anymore. I operate off of a couple dedicated servers to run the Black Vault. So data is backed up and mirrored and on different locations in different states. So I'm safe now. But at the time, 17 years ago, again, I mean, I really didn't think that this would go on. In retrospect, again, I would have done it a little differently, but sadly, I didn't. It is what it is. They destroyed the records. I was pretty disheartened by the whole thing. Now fast forward to 2009. I thought with the passage of time, 8 years or so, maybe the FAA would have found the records, or since technology changed a little bit, agencies are digitizing their records, I thought maybe there would be some luck involved. Maybe a new person at the FAA would handle my request and say, oh, well, we're not really sure what happened in 2001, but here you go. We have them now. I confirmed in 2009, all those records were destroyed. Fast forward again to this month, September of 2018. I'm going through some digital archives of the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA. Now, NARA hasn't digitized everything, but if you don't know what NARA is, it's kind of our nation's library. Those records retention schedules that I talked about, a lot of times those historical records are transferred over to NARA, and there they sit, sometimes collecting dust, sometimes for decades. And so I'm searching through some of these digital archives that were online and stumbled upon a UFO reference of a folder that talked about a Japan Airlines flight and a UFO encounter in '86. Anybody who knows their UFO history, that's pretty much only one case that it can be. Now, I was shocked because I was told everything from the FAA was destroyed. I knew these documents were from the FAA because the record group they were in was the record group of the FAA. Now, the organization of NARA is that everything fits into a long list of record groups, and then you drill down in the records group. So United States Air Force is a specific record group, FAA specific record group. Underneath that record group, then you have all sorts of different branching off of how they're organized and numbers and identifying numbers and so on and so forth. So I saw this and I was shocked because I thought there's no way that this is the same one, but I knew it had to be. Started going through them and discovered this was exactly what I was told was destroyed in 2001. In fact, It wasn't 107 pages that I found. In fact, there were more than 1,500 pages that I was able to uncover. Now, again, I don't know what, if any, have never been released before, if they have been released, but it was, 15 years ago and or 20 plus years ago, but they've been destroyed. I really don't know. But I came across these things, and they were exactly what I believe the FAA was going to send me, that only totaled 107 pages. Now there's 1,500. The document I want to specifically point you guys to, because it's really interesting, is the actual transcript from the pilot himself, as interviewed by the FAA. And he talked about the third UFO being a mothership. He kept falling back to that term. That's something that's important because this is a pilot who understands what's in the sky. He's highly trained. He understands what's flying around him. And he can pinpoint another, let's say, 747 flying in his vicinity. None of these UFOs lined or matched up with any of those types of things that he knew were out there. These were UFOs to him, and he kept calling the third one a mothership. Definitely check out the transcript, but in addition to the transcript, some of these other 1,500 pages, including transcripts with the other crew members, including the first officer and the flight engineer. It included signed statements from the FAA personnel that were watching the radar screens. It dissected the radar data. The FAA collected all of the radar data and input all of that data into similar machines, similar radar stations, I should say, so they could see on the screen what the radar people were seeing, what the radar operators were seeing. What they determined was that there was a strange phenomena that occurred at the exact moment that the pilot was seeing a UFO. Now, this is a fairly technical, complex topic, and I'll let you guys read it if you're interested, but they call them uncorrelated radar signals. In essence, what happens is when the radar energy comes out of a radar unit and it hits a craft and bounces back, you have a dot on your screen. But on rare occasions, what will happen is that energy will bounce back in addition to the transponder beacon of the aircraft itself. The result are multiple contacts on a radar screen. When you read the documents from the FAA public affairs official where he says, yeah, it's just really unfortunate that it happened at the same time. Here's his exact quote. "It is unfortunate that the uncorrelated target phenomena occurred just when the pilot was reported seeing something outside of his aircraft." That's the quote. So what are the odds of that? And I'm not sure what that means, what the FAA public affairs official is actually trying to say here. Is he saying that the UFO encounter created this phenomena? Is he saying that the radar blips that some said was a different craft other than Flight 1628? Is he saying that that was just a coincidence and there was no second craft? Well, then you have to discount and discredit the pilot and the crew who saw the multiple UFOs. So nothing really made sense in this. And when you read the sworn statements, the signed statements from the other FAA personnel, they start contradicting each other fairly strongly. One says he didn't see anything out of the ordinary, he just thought it was normal air traffic. Another one said he did believe that there was a UFO seen in the vicinity of Flight 1628, an unknown, unidentified craft. So there's a really, really large amount of gems in these 1,500 pages, and I could go on and on about what's in it, but definitely check out those transcripts. That's what I wanted to highlight more than anything else. And second runner-up, check out that radar explanation, because that kind of stuff where you've got a weird phenomena that occurs at the exact same time, and you have an FAA personnel from the public affairs office going, yeah, really kind of a coincidence that happened at the same time. I think that there is something very much to this story, and these documents that were once thought destroyed 17 years ago are now found. And not only have they been found, but a heck of a lot more to go with it, including a pile of newspaper clippings and including quite a few different pages from letters from the general public trying to get the FAA to send them the same documents that I sought. And back at this time in the late 1980s, they were paying near $200 to get the FAA to send them this information. That also is all in there, but a very interesting aspect to this all, that the FAA, using taxpayer dollars, did the investigation of Flight 1628. It was of public interest. They utilized taxpayer dollars, did the investigation, turned around, and sold it back to the public. That in itself is a pretty interesting revelation that you can see in all of these documents. So that being said, everything that I've talked about, including the documents now, the news headlines, my letter to the Stars Academy, and everything related to ATIP, the new document that just got discovered, is all available on the show notes page at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Thank you all for listening. I know that this was a beefy episode, lots of stuff to dissect and digest and look into and read and explore. I hope you all choose to do so whenever time permits. But more than anything else, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for listening. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off of the Black Vault Radio. We'll see you next time.